Well, we're back again with a one-on-one conversation with Andrew Bartlow and Jess Yuen. Today, we wanted to dive into priorities and prioritization because as an executive, as a leader, there's always a million things to do and you can never get to the end of your list. And it seems like in today's world of AI and just evolving everything, the list is just compounding and the intensity to get more done faster is top of mind. So we thought it would be useful to talk a bit about prioritization and how we talk to our clients and advise leaders on how to think about it. And maybe just touch on some of what makes it so hard to be an executive at these organizations.
So prioritization, how do we do it? There's too much to do and not enough time, no matter how many agents you have running in the background.
And I think this problem, whether you are the CEO or, the newest new grad at an organization, you have a to-do list. Many of us have grown up with the idea, I have things to do, I will write it down. The old school version of to-do list has been our email inbox, oftentimes dictates what we look at, when we look at it, and how fast. And so a basic fundamental thing that I work on with my clients is to move out of that mode and into your time is your priorities. And if your priorities aren't getting the needle moved on, then you need to refigure out how you're spending and allocating your time. So take that to-do list and turn it into time. So add into your calendar, when am I going to do the things on this list? Before doing that, though, there is a step that comes before it, which is what priority do I need to do this list in? And I laugh oftentimes at companies because just the other day, somebody was saying, oh yeah, we have 12 company priorities right now. And the word priority is supposed to indicate what's the most important thing. So if you have 12 priorities, that's very confusing because you're like, which of these 12 should I be working on right now? So Andrew, when you think about prioritization, is there an approach, a framework, a method that you like to use to figure out what order to tackle these items in?
Short answer, yes, but it's kind of flexible as well. I don't think I'm a productivity guru, but do talk a lot about prioritization as it relates to human resources, leadership, work. For me, I do calendar blocking, just like you talked about. I figure out what's most important and make sure that nothing gets over the top of it. Or if it does, then it's a very conscious choice, but I'm reserving that time. Like school drop off and school pickup for my fourth grader and sixth grader. I'm going to avoid taking a call or having a meeting that leads to disruption there. I'm a single dad. Nobody else is going to take the kids to school or pick them up. I don't want my 10-year-old waiting on the sidewalk crying or calling me. So I'll block that time. I've also blocked 8 to 9 most mornings to go to the gym. That helps me be healthy, be less fat, be happier in general. And just like you suggested, Jess, where something comes into my to-do list, instead of adding it to a list, I put it on my calendar. I look for the date, nothing shorter than a half-hour block, sometimes longer. And I hold that time so people don't book over the top of it. And if they do, it's my choice, and then I move it rather than delete it. That's my primary method. I guess maybe add one more piece, because that's more short-term activities, the stuff that just kind of comes in. The longer-term activities, just here to my right, I have a whiteboard where I have my 2026 goals. And so I've written down just a few things, and it's this visual aid that reminds me of these bigger ticket things that I'm working on. I have talk about return on investment. I want to make sure that that's a thread throughout everything I do. I want to increase the subscribers to the People Leader Accelerator mailing list. And I have a to and a from there. We have 10,000 now. I'd love to get that to 12 this year. Number of applications to People Leader Accelerator. It's one of my big goals. We're selective. It's still about half the people that apply get accepted. And so I want to continue to increase the quality, not necessarily the quantity. Those are a few things that are in front of me constantly. And so that's kind of a nice balance between the daily activities that just get calendared and time blocked and the bigger ticket things where I have the visual reminder.
Both those elements sound to me that concept of big rocks. If our listeners aren't familiar with the idea of like your time being a jar and you first want to put in the biggest rocks and then the smaller ones, then the pebbles, and then fill the rest with sand. Because if you do it in the inverse order, your jar will be filled completely with sand and all the little things that are coming your way, and you'll never get to the bigger things. And I love that you call out having on your calendar some of these fundamentals that people might have been listening and like, wait, you have your kids pickup on there and your gym time. Those are fundamental to being a great leader, is to have a body that is functioning and that you're moving and that you're feeding properly. I even have things like reminding me to take my vitamins. I have reminders to eat my lunch. And part of the lunch block in particular is because as leaders, we have a lot of meetings. I will move that block around. So I try to keep it around, within a couple of hours every day, but I will move it around just to make sure that there is some amount of time where I can eat. Because if I don't eat. That is the reality. I had a client just last week who was like, my first meal is at 6 p.m. That is far too late, far, far too late, especially when your office has free food in it.
Full on hangry at that point.
Yeah, like I don't know how you can think your best thoughts and do your best work if you haven't had any fuel in your body all day long. And so learning to leverage your calendar is very important. There are some clients that really struggle with that. And they say, it's on my calendar and I just ignore it. And I say to them, imagine that I'm there at that meeting with you. Would you ignore it? And so it's like, hey, treat the relationship with you just as important as a relationship with somebody else. And maybe you might reschedule with them once or twice, but by the third time you feel really guilty about it and you definitely are going to do it. I think that shift in perspective of how I treat myself is a really important mindset shift as a leader too. Right? It's important for me to sleep and eat and be able to function as a human being so that I can actually function really well as a leader.
Couldn't agree more about like blocking some of the necessary life activities. And if you allow people to just drop into your calendar at any time or don't operate by your calendar and just like random phone calls like Jensen Huang does, or Slack messages and must always be on all the time. And when somebody with a bigger business card or a client contacts you, you're always available. I think that's a life choice that may be really difficult to sustain. And then as you were talking about moving meetings, I keep my commitments. That's something that almost feels like integrity. I know it shouldn't feel that way, but like it almost feels like a deep value of if I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. And that includes a meeting with somebody else and often a meeting with myself or a work product out the door. And so it's a pretty high bar if I'm going to reschedule something. It's much easier for me to, just the way I'm made up, to say, hey, let's schedule it in the future. But some people are definitely not wired that way. Like some people have rescheduled multiple times to talk with us on the podcast, for example. I wonder if that's just based on the topic or if that is something that happens in other parts of their life with other meetings.
It comes back to this concept of prioritization, right?
Yeah.
And I can understand busy leaders, important people that we get to talk to on the podcast, and that they might need to prioritize internal meetings, or maybe there's something really important happening externally, and where we are in the prioritization list
Sure.
might be different than where we put them on our list, which is fair. We've talked about prioritization using frameworks like the Eisenhower matrix. I have one that I use called LNNO. I would love to just dive into that a little bit of like, how much do you use some of that thinking, and maybe a refresh on Eisenhower matrix for those in our audience who don't immediately go, oh, obviously important and urgent. But how do you think about when and how to use that? And how often are you leaning on a tool like that?
There are a bunch of different frameworks, and like anything, choosing when to use what tool is maybe more than half the job. So we've already talked about FIFO, which is first in, first out, which is like living out of your inbox. And so what's unread and is it flagged? That's a FIFO. Eisenhower matrix, which you just mentioned, is typically a 4-block. We teach people about it in People Leader Accelerator. The 2 axes in that 4-block are importance and urgency. And the general concept here is you should try to minimize some of the boxes and make more space for the not urgent, but really important, which is sort of those longer term projects that you can't just knock out in 5 minutes. And that's usually what suffers for busy people. The not urgent, don't have to do it today, but it's got to be done at some point and really important. I don't suggest that people use that for everything all the time, but it does promote the idea that more professionals would behave more like executives if they're thinking longer range, high impact. And so if you're really mired in the day-to-day activities and transactions, then often those bigger ticket items will suffer. That's why I talk a lot about Eisenhower matrix.
I know you're a big fan. I know many people who are big fans and find a lot of value in it. I'll be honest with you, I kind of hate it because I find it really hard, especially in a startup environment. Urgency and importance often get conflated. And so I find I have to think really hard to discern what is important versus what is urgent. And there's a classic, my first startup, I was the chief of staff to the CEO. And so I was in charge of like everything from the smallest details, like buying the toilet paper, to the big things like prepping the board deck. And there was one day where those two things were at odd, where we had run out of toilet paper and I also needed to get the board deck out. And I was like, they both seem really important. And what's funny is I used to run this workshop with teams where I would have them debate, what order would you do those two things in? And you would think it's so straightforward because almost anybody who hears it standalone will be like, how is this even a question? But when you get a team together, they can spend a very long time debating which of these things, because everyone's discernment on the urgency and the importance is slightly different, if not very different. And so the framework that I have gravitated to over time, it's more straightforward for me to be able to think about, is based off of Shreyas Doshi's L, N, and O acronym, which is leverage, neutral, and overhead. So for every task, thinking about, if I put in an hour, how much value does that unlock, essentially? And so highly leveraged things unlocks a lot of value. Neutral things are kind of a 1-for-1, and overhead is sort of like, I put time in, but I don't really get anything out of it.
Where's the board deck and the toilet paper fall in the L, N, and O?
I think with the leverage on that, and this is what's interesting, is you can define it for every organization slightly differently, whether it's in dollars or some other type of impact. But with the toilet paper and the board deck, is at the end of the day, what's the impact that we're looking for? And if it's business impact that we are unlocking, then it's pretty clear that we want to do the board deck. If we are unlocking something around the employee experience, or maybe we have a bathroom emergency that's happening, then it's a different type of impact that we are trying to unlock with that. And so what I like about it is that you can pretty quickly go through your to-do list, and I simplify it even further for clients. I say, forget the N and O. I take Shreyas Doshi's 3 parts and just say, there's one. Look for the highest leverage items.
Yeah.
It's essentially your big rocks, but it's your highest leverage items, and start there. And because it's a never-ending to-do list, like we won't get through all a million things. We are only going to be able to do a subset of them. And so starting with the highest leverage is the same thing as helping to just discern, hey, what's the priority of this?
I guess comparing that to the Eisenhower matrix, like the big takeaway is don't forget about the long range leverage things.
Yes. Yeah.
And everything else you can make a judgment on. But like the other 3 blocks, one is like, don't do, like just avoid it. And that might be kind of time wasting activities. I don't think board deck or toilet paper is in that category. Another box is often referred to as delegate. So if it's urgent but not important, hey, could you turn to somebody else and say like, hey, I've got to get the board deck out, but anybody could go to Target or wherever and pick up some TP. In my mind, actually fits pretty nicely into the Eisenhower matrix, where that's a delegate. And actually the board deck is probably important and urgent, and that's the do first box. So I kind of like that. There's a similar challenge in performance ratings, where if you have too many categories, you end up spending all this time and all this overhead trying to decide whether somebody's a 4 or a 5 or a 3 or a 4. And you don't want to have 19 categories that you're already burning your mental calories to try to make the decisions. You want it to be as intuitive as possible.
Yeah, I would say generally I tend towards what's the simpler version of this, so that we don't have to spend cycles trying to figure out that nuance. It's also why in like performance ratings, in an ideal world, we only have 3. We can have a different discussion about that at another time, of the benefits of how many ratings and what are the pros and cons of each of those. But it is because you want to have simplicity of, I need to figure out what to do. I don't want it to take longer than it takes to actually do it, because then I would just do it and not even bother.
Yeah, that's right. There are a few more frameworks that we could talk about. I'm full of frameworks. One that pops to mind, way, way back in the 90s, I was at General Electric during the Jack Welch and Jeff Immelt switchover, and I was the HR leader for a small business and equipment management services. We were really pushing Six Sigma projects at the time. And we were getting caught up in, we're trying to make everything a project. Maybe there's a connection here to AI. Like, do we need to use AI for this thing? So there's a project. And then there's a Six Sigma tool enabled. Like, there are certain tools and techniques that you might use to solve a problem. And maybe you use that, and maybe like you use AI to help you deliver something, but it doesn't need to be a build. And then the other category was just do it. You don't necessarily need to run everything through the gating reviews and the full DMAIC or demand process. And so it's like a just do it, big project, or somewhere in between where you navigate your way through it. That was kind of an interesting framework as the org was dealing with both trying to educate how to use this really useful set of tools without adding too much bureaucracy along the way.
I like that. I was in this conversation for a parenting group. Someone would brought up the discussion with their kid of how they're using size of a problem. So at school, we talk about whether something's like a mountain or a molehill, or the emotions that are being attached to it commensurate with the size of the problem. But they actually had attached it to money. So is this a penny problem or like $1 million problem? I really like that because it relates to what this GE approach was as well, which is how big is it ultimately, right? What is that impact? What's the leverage out of it? And so the idea of these penny problems is, as a leader, you start to need to let go of your penny problems and focus more and more on the multi-million dollar ones.
Yeah. Maybe to put a finer point on the GE framework, it was less about how valuable it was, and it was more about how complicated it was. So it needed to be both valuable and complicated to make it a real project. And if it's less complicated, then like just go do the thing. There's another framework when I was building my failed SaaS product that the product and engineering team introduced me to called Moscow. That's spelled like the city in Russia, and it stands for must have, is the M, should have, could have, and won't have. And so that helps with product and engineering, like, hey, I was a non-technical founder. I wanted this performance management tool to do all this stuff. But that was a prioritization tool to figure out what are we absolutely not going to tackle? What is the most essential element of this product? And so that's an interesting framework to consider, not so much for daily tasks, but as you're building something.
I love that you're full of all these different frameworks and ways to think about it. I was going to comment on if something is pretty uncomplicated and lightweight to do, like if it takes you less than 2 minutes, just do it. And for a while, I embraced this, like write that quick email, take care of that form. And I've actually moved away from it in recent years, and feel free to push back on this approach. But I have found, especially for executives, it is sand that these 2-minute things are. And so if I was embracing this, it takes less than 2-minute rule, I fill my day with sand and I never get to my bigger rocks. And so instead, what I ended up doing was I would have basically time for sand. It would be like, clear out the email inbox or whatnot, but I would time box it so that it wouldn't take over everything. And then my brain kind of knew there was a place for it. Otherwise, I have this very much sense of urgency that I think is ingrained from my management consultant days of like, I need to answer the email and get things out really fast and have 2-minute turnarounds on everything.
I think that's really smart, again, to time block the sand. We have one bucket of sand. It's not 10 buckets of sand in a day. It's one bucket, and here's where it's going to fit. Before I get out of bed in the morning, I pull up my phone and I clear out my email. I delete everything, I act on everything, and sometimes it takes me 10 minutes, sometimes it takes me close to an hour. But before I actually start my day, I have cleared largely my email or flagged something for follow-up and then booked a meeting with myself to go act on it. I do the same thing at night before I shut out lights. And so sometimes that's fast, sometimes that's slow, but twice a day, I'm playing in the sand. What I don't do is time block it during the day. It's just if I happen to have a break in my schedule, or if somebody cancels, or if a meeting goes short, then I'll immediately go to the inbox and start tackling that. And I guess that works the way that sand should. It just kind of fills in the cracks.
Yeah. And I think the reality is one block for sand a day doesn't really work. So it's typically two or three that get blocked in just because there's so much. And it's email, Slack, Discord, whatever your messaging platforms are for your organization. And I think there's a reality to that. The one thing I would encourage for a leader who's trying to figure out how do I prioritize in a busy world like this is when in your week or your day, maybe it's both, are you coming back to those bigger rocks? Do I have clarity on like what is the big three things that if I do nothing else today, I absolutely have to get done? My tendency too is like first thing, go check my email and what's going on. But if I go there first without saying, hey, oh, I need to prepare for this podcast or for this client meeting or, think ahead about this, thought piece I want to write about, I then can get deep into my inbox and all the bits of sand and never come back out of it. And
Yeah.
I know that about myself. The encouragement I would have for anybody listening and for my clients that I regularly do is like, when is that time? Whether it's first thing in the morning, I have found that the beginning of a week or even the end of the prior week, like Friday as you're closing out or Sunday night before you get started, think about your week ahead and what are those big things you need to move the needle on. And then making sure that your calendar is reflecting time against that, whether it's in meetings with other people that you're going to move those needles, or if it's time alone that you need to be able to do that.
The theme that I think I want to reinforce for the audience is that the biggest, most impactful stuff is often not something that you can complete right away in the moment. It takes a little bit more time. It takes some thought. It might take multiple people, multiple iterations. And that's often what gets kicked down the road. And so you've got to intentionally reserve the time to work on that. Like some executive teams have offsites and planning sessions to do exactly that. You go travel to your investment bankers high rise to go have the meetings with them and dedicated time when you're thinking about a big deal. That's kind of the concept. And for HR professionals, I guess the very tactical, practical suggestion that I might make is before you go to your inbox, your FIFO, all the sand sandwich like I have, before you try to roll out all the various HR projects and initiatives that air quote every good company does, you ground yourself in what is actually the most important thing. And so we do a ton of this in People Leader Accelerator, and it's surprising how much of a build it ends up being. It's not like a light switch. It's like a muscle building around what is my organization trying to accomplish and how can I directly support that? If my org wants to increase revenue, reduce cost, accelerate product roadmap, then does the engagement survey directly affect that more than other things that I could be working on, like sales team onboarding? Sales team probably has something very direct to do with revenue. There's probably something that you could be doing to support your sales or go-to-market team. If you're building a product, doing something with product design engineering is probably useful. And so as we talk about prioritization, I feel really remiss if I don't take that back to the HR professional role. Yep, lots of sand, lots of people asking for lots of stuff. In our role, maybe more than most others, we have all these different stakeholders and the volume of employee requests and mid-level manager and senior leader requests. And then this list of things that we think all good companies should do. If we ground ourselves in what's most important to my business right now, that will help us make some of those bigger decisions about what are the big rocks, what are the initiatives that ladder to that.
Yeah. Where's the biggest leverage?
Yeah, the LNO.
Yeah. I think the couple of maybe tips and tricks. So I want to be able to do that. How do I actually do that? Having a block on your calendar that's think about the highest leverage things in the org is pretty intimidating to sit down to for most people. And so I would say, take that one step further. Bring in your company. I would even put into the invite, here's what my company's big goals are for this year. Here's my hypothesis on the 2 or 3 areas that I think maybe the people team can impact that the most.
Yeah.
And then a to-do, brainstorm 3 to 5 ideas on how to support the sales team or support product. You don't have to come up with everything right in your little 30-minute block or 1-hour block that you've set aside. And the next block that you have, take it from wherever you left off. You have 3 to 5 ideas. evaluate which of these is most feasible that I could do in whatever's next, Q2, Q3. And so breaking down the really big, vague, lofty goal that you have into subsegments, really, really handy. And is part of helping yourself out so that when you sit down to that calendar block, add in all the things that might be useful. Put in a link to your company's goals for the year. Put in a link to the latest board deck, or, maybe screenshot the conversation that your CEO sent you about what he or she cares about. But I would say set yourself up for as much ease into that thinking time as possible.
That's so smart. Ground it in the business context.
Mm-hmm.
Bring your board decks, bring your all hands meetings, bring your company-wide goals, bring that context that helps you look upstream. And where a lot of organizations, I think, get this wrong is they do annual planning and they ask everybody to come up with their annual goals. And at the same time, they're working on the company goals. And the company goals actually end up getting announced kind of last. And usually those are categories rather than actual goals. I like to talk about the fake goals, like make more money, save money, launch a thing, and be a great place to work. Like those are too general to be like really actionable. And many of those conflict with each other. So an effective company level goal will help your whole pyramid, your whole org prioritize. And if Jensen Huang has 60 direct reports that he doesn't have one-on-ones with, I have to imagine that they have really, really clear goals and priorities at a company level. It's like the grease in the engine. It's the thing that makes everything flow more smoothly, that allows you to delegate and empower, is if everybody knows what's more important.
Yeah, it allows for easier alignment for sure, not only for your team, but yourself. Use it as that guiding map. Sometimes we write these things and then we don't come back to them. And that feels like a big miss too. If we spent all this time to write it, let's use it for what it was intended, which is to help make this prioritization and alignment easier.
And ask curious questions. Use this as an opportunity to have a chat with your head of financial planning and analysis or your CFO and understand, hey, what are the most important things? And they might have a slightly different view than your go-to-market or sales leader. Will you seem a little silly and not knowledgeable by asking them those questions? Maybe, but boy, the sooner you can get over that, the better, because you'll learn so much about the business, and people love to teach. People love to share their knowledge. And then if you have your hypotheses about what might be most important, you can pressure test those hypotheses with some of your key peer level, other functional and departmental leaders.
I love that you're bringing it back to the business. And it's also reminding me, there was something I did when I was in seat, which is I would go to all the executive leaders and say, what's the biggest thing that you want the people team to be working on this quarter or this half? And I would see both how much they agreed with each other, because sometimes they didn't, but also how much did that align with what we saw as the highest leverage or most business related things. And if there were gaps, that's also an opportunity to educate and get everybody on the same page of what we're trying to do here as a people team. I love that you're pointing that out, and also want to bring in this perspective of survey your leaders of like what they think you're supposed to be working on right now.
Yeah, again, the podcast listeners wouldn't have seen my side eye when you mentioned asking other departmental leaders what HR and the people team should be doing. And that's in part because I think most departmental leaders of other departments don't really know what good HR looks like, don't know how HR can support them. I really agree with the idea of being closely connected with the peer group, but I might ask the question a little bit differently. And it would be, instead of what can we do for you, because that necessitates them knowing our capabilities and our ability to contribute. And they might have this idea that we throw the holiday party and we do payroll and benefits, which we do. And that's highly visible. And some of the other stuff is less visible, frankly. I might ask them, what's the most important thing that you're working on this quarter, that your team is working on this quarter? And then we use our noggin to figure out how we can help with that in some way.
This is an important nuance. So I was taking what you had originally said and was assuming that that conversation was happening to be able to support them of what's most important to you. 1,000% agree. Like, you should be having that conversation. The addition that I'm bringing in is that because there is this misconception about what the people team does, that sometimes you saying, oh, great, you care most about sales onboarding and making sure that's fast and snappy, awesome. They don't associate with that. That might be something the people team's working on. And they might
Right.
actually say, the most important thing that you figure out for me is hiring and making sales comp numbers easier. And so if I'm over
Right.
here trying to work on sales onboarding and I don't address what they think is the most important thing that my team is working on, they're going to think that I failed or that our team isn't doing
Sure.
what we're supposed to be doing. So I want to make sure the conversation's happening to bridge the gap between
Yeah.
this unspoken expectation that does happen. Why aren't you holding more happy hours for my sales team, right? We didn't think that was business oriented enough that we would spend time on it. So we're not doing it. And then you have a grumpy leader who's like, oh my gosh, they're not doing the most basic thing of party planning for us. And it's like,
Right.
okay, let's have that
Socialize,
conversation.
pressure test. Yeah. Don't stop with what should we be doing for you. But like once you understand what's important to the business, what's important to those functions, maybe the cycle is you're curious, you gather information, you come up with your hypotheses of these might be the most important things that we could help with, like let's help with sales onboarding. Then you do round two. Round two is, hey, based on our last conversation, here are the things that we're going to be working on this quarter. And I really think that we can be helpful with sales onboarding. And you might get some pushback. You might say, no, we've got that covered. And so then use your judgment about how hard to push and whether it be engaged or not. But Jess, I think that you're nailing it is like, make sure that you understand what their expectations are and proactively identify the opportunities for impact.
Yes. Just because they have the expectation doesn't mean that you need to do it,
Right.
but it means close the gap on the expectations, whether it's, hey, here's what we're actually going to be working on that's different. Here's why. Or that's a great idea. I think there is value there. We do have capacity for that. Let's make sure that we get it done. And either of those can be a very acceptable thing to do, but leaving it unsaid leads to a lot of maybe missed expectations and confusion down the road and can hurt the team ultimately. And so how do we get ahead of that?
I really love how this conversation has evolved from personal productivity and prioritization to organizational level prioritization and productivity. So yeah, it's more complicated when there are more people involved. If it's just us, it's our inbox and our to-do list. But yeah, most of us aren't solopreneurs. Most of us are part of something that is feeding a greater good. And we have coworkers with sometimes competing interests and different understanding of what's needed. And so getting alignment is as important as getting priorities spelled out.
Absolutely agree.
Maybe we wrap on that note for our listeners and watchers. Hope this conversation was helpful for you and would love to get your comments and let us know if you want more conversations like this. Jess, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Andrew.